Okay, picture this. Imagine a courtroom where the defendant isn't a person at all, but an entire library. I mean, a trial not for a crime someone committed, but for a crime of ideas? Well, that's exactly what happens back in Paris in the year 1240. This was a super high stakes intellectual battle, and it pitted one man against, well, pretty much the most powerful forces in all of medieval Europe. I mean, this was a true David versus Goliath showdown. On one side, you've got the combined might of a king, King Louis IX of France, a pope, Pope Gregory IX, and basically the entire theological and political machine of the medieval church. And on the other side, just one single Jewish scholar. So yeah, this wasn't just some friendly debate. It was a completely impossible challenge. So who was this man, right? Who was this person tasked with defending literally centuries of Jewish thought? Well, let me tell you, he wasn't just some local teacher. No, he was one of the most brilliant minds of his entire generation. All right, let's meet our protagonist, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. This guy was a big deal. He was the head of the Great Talmudic Academy in Paris, which means he was in charge of educating over 300 students. He was the top authority, the chief scholar, and now, suddenly, he's summoned to the royal court to stand as the one and only defender of the entire Talmud. But, a trial like this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It wasn't random. It was really the result of a perfect storm, a convergence of religious anxiety, economic jealousy, and a really, really personal betrayal that set the stage for this huge confrontation. So let's break it down. There were kind of three main forces pushing this thing forward. First up, you had the church, which was dealing with its own internal crises and frankly needed an enemy to rally everyone against. Second, you've got economic competition. The rising merchant class in the cities saw the Jewish community as rivals and were all too happy to support policies against them. And third, and this is the real kicker, the final push came from an insider. And this is where it gets really personal, just a gut punch of a story. The main accuser, the guy who brought 35 charges against the Talmud directly to the Pope, was a man named Nicholas Donin. And who was he? He was a convert to Christianity who had once studied in Rabbi Yechiel's own academy, a student turned prosecutor against his own teacher. Just wow. Okay, so let's set the scene. The trial itself kicks off in June of 1240 at the royal palace of King Louis IX. You've got the Queen Mother and the highest bishops in the land sitting as judges, and the defendant, the Talmud, the central foundational text of Rabbinic Judaism, was about to be prosecuted. So Nicholas Donin, the former student, lays out his case, and he really comes at it from four main angles. First, falsification. He claims the Talmud is a total forgery, that it has no real authority from Moses. Second, blasphemy. He says it's packed with insults against Jesus and Christianity. Third, hostility. He argues it actually encourages hatred and harm towards non-Jews. And finally, irrationality, that the whole thing is just filled with illogical, absurd stories. Now, here's something that's just incredible. While there were four rabbis technically there for the defense, the historical records make it crystal clear. Rabbi Yechiel was the only one who actually spoke. He stood as the chief spokesman. He alone answered every single charge. Just one man against a whole panel of the most powerful people in the kingdom. So how do you even begin to defend against that? Well, one of Rabbi Yechiel's arguments was just genius, especially when it came to that charge of blasphemy. He explained that the Yeshu mentioned in the Talmud was not Jesus of Nazareth. He pointed out that based on the timeline in the text, this Yeshu guy lived a whole century earlier. So by arguing they were two totally different people, he basically neutralized one of the prosecution's most dangerous attacks. Pretty clever, right? And he didn't stop there, not by a long shot. He argued that when the Talmud talks about goyim or Gentiles, it's referring to ancient idolaters, not the Christians of his day. He explained that all those seemingly absurd stories, they're allegories, teaching tales, not literal laws. He even pointed out that they're a lot like some of the fantastic stories you find in the Christian Bible. And he made sure to affirm that Jewish law actually commands Jews to pray for the government's well-being and that, hey, non-Jews could absolutely be considered righteous. I mean, Rabbi Yechiel presented this brilliant, nuanced, and incredibly courageous defense. But let's be real. In a trial where the judges and the prosecutors are basically on the same team, the verdict was pretty much a foregone conclusion. And this is where the story takes its tragic turn. So, the verdict came down from the Tribunal of Bishops. And
The Talmud was found guilty. Guilty on all counts. A book, an entire living tradition, was condemned.
So what happens when a book is found guilty? Well, for a couple of years, Jewish leaders tried desperately to appeal the verdict, but it was no use. In 1244, the sentence was carried out. And that brings us to this number, 24. 24 cartloads of priceless, handwritten manuscripts of the Talmud and all its commentaries were confiscated and dragged to a public square in Paris. And then, in an act of just shocking cultural destruction, those 24 cartloads of books were set on fire. The intellectual heart of European Jewry literally went up in flames. This event was so horrifying, so unprecedented, that it actually led to a change in church policy. By 1248, the strategy shifted. Instead of outright burning, it became about censorship, going through the texts and deleting or altering any passages they found offensive. But the story doesn't end in the flames. An event this traumatic, it leaves behind a powerful legacy, one of both, deep grief, but also incredible resilience. In fact, one of Rabbi Yechiel's own students, a man named Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg, actually witnessed the burning. He composed this haunting lament that begins with the line, "Ask, O you who are burnt in fire, after the welfare of those who mourn you." And that poem, it's still recited by Jews all around the world every single year on the fast of Tisha B'Av. It's a direct living link all the way back to the ashes of Paris in 1244. So that brings us back to the man at the center of this storm. Whatever happened to Rabbi Yechiel, the defender who stood alone against an empire? Well, here, history offers us a pretty compelling mystery. Okay, so there are two main theories about his fate. For centuries, the tradition always held that Rabbi Yechiel and his students managed to leave France for the Holy Land. The story goes he reestablished his academy in the city of Acre and died there years later. But modern research has turned up something new, a fragment of a tombstone found in Paris bearing his name. This suggests he might have never left at all and died in the very city where he fought his greatest battle. When you step back and look at the big picture, the trial of the Talmud was so much more than just a single event. It really was a fundamental turning point. It marked a huge shift in Jewish-Christian relations, signaling a move away from, let's say, a kind of tense tolerance towards an era of active suspicion, investigation, and censorship that would go on for centuries. Which leaves us with one last big question. 24 cartloads of books were turned to ash, a devastating loss, but the Talmud survived. It was copied and studied in secret, passed down from generation to generation. They burned the pages, sure, but they couldn't destroy the words. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can you ever truly burn an idea?